Heather got so excited she left us.
Oh yeah, where did Heather go?
She'll be able to come back right back in.
She's like, I'm gonna go get some coffee.
Right?
He's going to check the strategic plan.
She's gonna go check on the font. That's what she's doing.
Or the fonts.
Oh goodness.
We can save money by making everything Arial narrow.
Oh my goodness.
It's less ink to print.
Okay, so I don't know if y'all did this for your exams, but when I was a doc student at UCLA, you could only have so many pages for each response. So the trick was you wrote and then you changed it to Arial narrow. So you get another quarter of a page.
So funny.
Like, use Arial narrow.
Yeah, funny story. Now that you mention that, I was given a page limit for my dissertation by Elisa. She said there is no way you can go over this page limit because she knew that I was a writer. And the reason that I was saved by that page limit was because the requirements from the graduate college at Miami only asked us to have 1.5 spacing rather than double spacing. So yeah. Otherwise, it was going to be hard to chop at the very end. So
if you're a grad student out there joining us right now, here are some free tips as part of the beginning of this webinar.
1.5 Arial narrow.
There you go.
Now, I don't know about y'all, but I think I've shared this with Kim before, that like sometimes I'm in a certain mood and then I have to change my font to match that mood. I don't know if y'all do that. It's weird. I've been writing on a lot of Arial.
What mood were you in when you did this?
I think I was feeling a little hopeful.
Oh, that's good.
So maybe I should have had like more loopy kind of text on here.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started with the official webinar. We'll take this out in the editing process for the recorded piece. So welcome everybody to this webinar. Good morning here from the land currently known as Las Vegas, the traditional homelands of the Southern Paiute. Welcome to our sixth and actually final ASHE 2020 presidential webinar. This has been a series of 6 webinars curated by ASHE 2020 President Carrie Ann O'Mara to share research and best practices around higher education areas most impacted by COVID-19, with a particular focus on equity for students, faculty, and staff. And I can say that our 5 other webinars have done just that, and chatting with these 6 incredible folks, we're definitely gonna achieve that today as well. I do wanna share that the webinar is being live captioned. Those captions can be accessed by clicking the CC button or closed caption button in your menu bar. This webinar is also being recorded. Yeah, had to double check. It's being recorded and will be available on the ASHE website probably in the next week or so. Throughout the webinar, you can pose questions to the panelists using the Q&A feature in the menu bar. They may answer questions as we're going, either live, or they may type a response, or they may answer some questions at the end. I also want to share with everybody that, in case you don't know already, that today is our conference and pre-conference regular registration deadline. So if you haven't registered for our virtual conference experience coming up in a few weeks, be sure to do that by 11:59 Pacific tonight to save a little bit on those registration fees. So I'm very excited to introduce today's webinar, which is titled Resisting Disaster, Academic Capitalism and White Supremacy, a coalitional re-envisioning of the academic workplace. And I'm very excited that we're ending with this discussion. I think it's timely, I think it's relevant. I think it's a very good book into this webinar series, and I think the world of these 6 individuals that are going to be joining us and sharing today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to them. So Leslie, it's your show.
Sure. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Gary, Rhoades, and I are supposed to be facilitating today, but I think it's going to be just a really nice shared conversation. but we're going to get started with some short introductions and some land acknowledgements. Because not all of us are currently working in our institutions or even near our institutions, we've all taken the liberty to develop a land acknowledgement that reflects where we are working and living in this current moment. So everyone, I'm Leslie Gonzalez, and I'm an associate professor. I study higher education and faculty issues. Today and for the last, 6-7 months, my family and I, meaning my partner and my daughter, we've all been working from the ancestral and traditional and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe people, which consists of the Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. I also want to acknowledge that many of us, including today and for the last 6 months, have been utilizing Skype and Zoom and Google platforms to hold our meetings. And in doing so, we are also benefiting from Indigenous lands that are located in California and other locations. And so I just want to recognize that we're also indebted to those lands and to those people at the beginning of this session. And so I'll go ahead and turn to Gary for your introduction.
Thank you, Leslie. Good morning. I'm Gary Rhoades. I'm a professor of higher education. I study academic labor and academic institutions. And since we're focusing on the workplace in this particular panel and session, I thought as a member of the newly formed United Campus Workers of Arizona, Local 7065, and the Coalition for Academic Justice, UA, we acknowledge the stewardship and sovereignty of the 22 Native nations that have inhabited the land for centuries in what we now call Arizona. We also acknowledge that our workplace in Tucson rests on the colonized ancestral lands of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui peoples. We work to honor these tribal lands and communities and the indigenous students and staff in our employing university, and to counter-mobilize against the continued extraction of resources from and exacting of pain on these lands and these communities, to envision and transform these workplaces to better serve and steward Native peoples, tribal nations, and these lands. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gary. I think we'll go ahead and go to Kim.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Kimberly Griffin. I'm a professor and associate dean in the College of Education. I'm also the editor of the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education. And most recently, I've been spending my time thinking a lot about how we understand the experiences and outcomes of women and men of color in graduate education and the professoriate, working towards creating more equity and inclusion in the academy more generally. I'd like to start today by recognizing the Piscataway people. I honor their legacy, the ancestors and their descendants, the youth and the elders. The Piscataway were forcibly removed and displaced from their homelands, which is the land that I now live, teach, conduct research, and learn on. I use this moment to reflect on the history of violence and daily oppression Indigenous populations face, as well as reaffirm my commitment to advocacy and justice for Indigenous people everywhere.
Thanks so much, Kim. Gerardo?
Hi, everybody. I'm Gerardo Blanco in the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. And while my institution has not adopted a land acknowledgement, today I would like to honor the legacy of the Mashpee Wampanoag people, Aquinnah Wampanoag people, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts people, in whose ancestral lands I have settled as an immigrant. It is also noteworthy that the Mashpee Wampanoag people, even though they were the first nation to come in encounter with European settlers, are currently at risk of losing their recognition by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I really think it's important to raise awareness about these because these are not only historical issues, these are also contemporary issues that we have responsibilities to engage with. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And also it's a pleasure to turn it over to my dear colleague, Z.
Hi all, Zena Galazzo. Really humbled to be here and appreciate the ask and to be amongst such good company. I'm an associate professor of trans studies and education, and I live and work on the unceded lands of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui peoples.
Thanks, E. We'll go ahead and wrap up with Heather, and then we'll dive in.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Heather Schotten. I'm a citizen of the Wichita and affiliated tribes, and also a descendant of the Kiowa and Cheyenne people. I currently serve as an associate professor and chair of educational leadership and policy studies, and I engage with and am responsible to research, scholarship, teaching, and learning on the land currently known as Oklahoma, which served as the traditional homelands of my people, the Wichita people and the Caddo people, and also served as a traditional site of gathering, exchange, and migration for the Kiowa, Apache, Comanche, and Osage nations. I also recognize that Oklahoma is home to 39 tribal nations, many of which were violently removed from their homelands as a result of settler colonial policies, and call Oklahoma home now. And my work is responsible to them and accountable to upholding their sovereignty. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schotten, and thank you everyone for your introductions and for taking the time to articulate a land acknowledgement that is meaningful and that helps us understand where you are living and working today and all the debts that we owe. And also, Gerardo, to noting that this is not a historical issue, but an ongoing one. So thank you. Everyone, we are very excited to bring to you this webinar. We developed some guiding questions to help us think through this webinar today. And the first, we want to do a few things in this webinar. We want to bring together a set of arguments that rarely, I think, are in conversation the ways in which they should be in conversation, which is what we know about academic capitalism, and we're going to learn today, or maybe refresh our minds today of what disaster academic capitalism is, and white supremacy. Our premise is that disaster academic capitalism really thrives on or hinges on white supremacy, but we want to really fully articulate those arguments and bring them together. And we want to understand how those things work together, particularly in relation to the academic workplace, and particularly in relation to COVID. This webinar, I think the idea for this webinar came from a variety of conversations. At one point, Gary and I were having a conversation, and he was articulating to me the frustration that he felt with many of the institutions' responses to COVID and this framing as a crisis, and how institutions were utilizing this situation to make some less than equitable decisions. And so we're going to really engage with these kinds of issues and these intersections today. I'm going to ask us to first start with Gary. Gary, I think that when most folks think about academic capitalism, we think about the work of Sheila Slaughter, of your work with Larry Leslie. Tell us a little bit about what academic capitalism is generally, but really what your thinking is around disaster academic capitalism, because this is something I've seen you write and talk and think about a lot lately. So can you get us started there?
Absolutely. Thank you, Leslie. And as others have said, it's really a delight to be here with these folks on the panel who are fabulous folks and have stretched my thinking, and to be with all of you as well. So what I'll start with is actually something that I said in a 3-minute video I did for ASHE, and that is that I can't really do academic capitalism the same again, having read the work and interacted with a range of colleagues, but particularly with a new colleague here at the University of Arizona, Karina Salazar, who has connected the recruitment, off-campus recruitment practices of universities, not only to academic capitalism, but to white supremacy and white settler colonialism, in a focus on how we redline in where we recruit and where we don't recruit. So the idea of disaster academic capitalism, or some might say disastrous academic capitalism, is that it's deeply entangled with white supremacy and white settler colonialism, just like capitalism is. The colonialism of European settlers, the slavery, the exploitation of a variety of immigrant and communities of color, and extracting surplus value from their labor. So what I want to do is first just briefly, so academic capitalism is often understood as organizations engaging in private market and market-like behaviors, and it is that. But deeper than that, it's an organization theory about workplaces and about organizational practices and logics. So there's a logic of accumulation, a logic of scarcity and austerity and hyper-competition, which I think some of us will be talking about today. Even in a time of a once-in-a-100-year pandemic, we're trying to position ourselves for rankings and the like, to strategically plan how in 30 or 40 years or 20 years we can increase our rankings and standing. It's also a set of assumptions about corporate management and structures. And it's a set of what some have called mean policies that lead to more precarious production workers who are less and less have any due process protections, who are more and more casualized, and a growth in managerial authority and non-production positions in support professions. So what makes disaster academic capitalism? And I think one way of thinking about this is to frame it as under cover of COVID. So under the excuse of, oh, there's this crisis. And usually, and I'll add the recession and the racial reckoning that we're in the midst of. Under cover of COVID, we have this financial crisis that means we have to think in new ways. We have to do more with less. And what's ironic about this is that these framings don't acknowledge that, in fact, we're simply accelerating and heightening ongoing practices and structures that preceded COVID. In some ways, COVID further uncovers the inequities and the oppressive structures and practices of institutions. And I think it's important for us, we're going to talk later about how to counter-mobilize against that, but it's important for us to understand that there's a continuity here.
Yes.
Between pre-COVID and what we're experiencing COVID. I'll give just two examples. Great Inside Higher Ed piece yesterday in which Dean Squire and Kevin McClure nicely pointed out that the layoffs, like furloughs, disproportionately impact and adversely impact and punish and lead to economic destruction for the least resourced, for the most marginalized, for communities of color among our employees. So we continue that practice even in the midst of a pandemic. We're throwing people out of work and throwing them out of having health care. And we're starting with people who are disproportionately in categories that are disproportionately employees of color, employees for marginalized communities. Second example is the reentry plans, in which so much in the kind of institution that I'm in, and so many of us are in, is about bringing back students, especially out-of-state students. Those tend to be disproportionately white students. And essentially those students are super spreaders of COVID in communities that, I'll take Tucson as an example, have disproportionately higher proportions of people of color, people who are in low-income jobs, people who are working in essential jobs, can't afford to stay home. And so we are literally doing what happened in the settling of the US. We are having settlers, our out-of-state students, coming back and spreading the disease that disparately impacts BIPOC communities. And so that's the disaster part. We continue to privilege white supremacy and white settler colonialism practices, even in the midst of a pandemic when you might think we would all take a pause as institutions to simply find ways to care for the communities and the people in those communities in which we're situated. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to who's next, Leslie?
I think actually this is a great opportunity, a great time to hand it over to Z, because I think Z, that some of your comments and thinking will be a great segue here.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Gary, for laying some of that groundwork. I think it's going to be really helpful. So I want to spend a little bit of time, not too much time, but a little bit of time reading an email from the president at my institution. And for those folks that understand the double entendre of the word reading, You're welcome, because that's what we're going to be doing here. So I want to start off by just asking a series of questions as folks look over this email. And here are the questions that I'm thinking about when I look at this. What does it mean to discuss notions of friendship and community when and where there is none? How is whiteness as politeness embedded in the positioning of, quote, us as, quote, friends through institutional means and statements? What is the effect of these affective moments that point to ruptures for those of us who have never belonged and are used to assert liberal humanist fantasies of the benevolent academy or university? And then the last question that I have is, how is the positioning of, quote, us as, quote, friends, who are also a, quote, family, occlude the violences embedded and sedimented? So how are they further enactments of violence through this evasion? And I start here as a way to, and let me just say this is one of the many emails that the president at the University of Arizona has sent to faculty and staff over the last several months as we've been working through the pandemic and also working through intensely draconian furlough policies at our university. And I start here as a way to point to the ongoing desire of the institution to cover over the bad feeling that's motivated by the attenuation of life for marooned people. Here, I mean, not only those essential workers who are mistreated, and I should say that maybe more actively and not passively, who the university continues to mistreat, but also those who are desired insofar as we allow the university to project a sense of doing the work of equity without doing the work of equity. So the words that I really think are deeply problematic in statements like this, and I want to recognize the work that my colleagues, Dr. Diane Squire and Dr. Rosie Perez and I were able to do together in an RHE piece where we actually looked at what is the template. We talked about a template for institutional response statements, specifically looking at DACA, but here we see that this template is carried through for other sorts of quote unquote crises, right? This ongoing moment of violence. So the words that I'm thinking about that really are deeply problematic are words like friends, we, right? This royal we, as if we are all together in this, as if we all have the same kinds of stakes. The notion of getting through, the notion of emerging stronger, being a wildcat family. Whenever I see any indication that we're a family, my feathers start to ruffle a little bit, a lot of it. And also the word our. So for those of us who are marooned populations, these words only serve to highlight the always already chasm we experience and the lack of connection that we feel to the institution. We're only friends and family. We will only get through and emerge stronger. And we are only an us and an our when the institution needs us, needs to use us as such. Messages like this then signal an ongoing extraction. So I think Gary's commentary about settler logics makes a lot of sense here. Comments that a number of people have made around anti-Black logics in the academy. I think a lot about Laurie Patton Davis's work around epistemological anti-Blackness in the academy. And also through my work, I'm thinking a lot about trans-misogynist logics and how those are embedded in the academy as well. This is what these messages signal, right? This notion of ongoing extraction, which depends on and is rooted in these logics, and at the cost of those who are already the most vulnerable. Also, for those of us who already feel disconnection, the gilded approach creates an affective field that moves us further from the university. So it actually only serves to make us feel more alien and to deepen the ongoing waves of negative feeling that these messages desire to overlook. So the idea is to look over it, but the fact is, as Sarah Ahmed said, that we can't look over it, and so we need to then do something about it. And so maybe we can talk about that. I'm happy to share some thoughts when we get to the solidarity and coalitional piece.
Yeah, Thanks so much, Zee, for your comments. You know, you make me think a lot about, you know, like you, I've always been very suspicious of any reference to family that comes from an institutional document, because I'm like, well, what family? But also the pool of family, the pool of family is also, it's also one of those patriarchal logics. It has a lot of, it can generate a lot of support, right? Because who doesn't want to be part of a family or a community? So at moments right now where we are in such crisis, it can serve two purposes. It can pull at the desire for community or for family when we're so physically unable to connect. And so it's doing a lot of work here in this document. So thanks, Zee, for pointing this out. I want to turn to Heather and Kim, and y'all can, you know, maybe do some tag teaming here, but I know that when we first started to talk about this webinar, you had just recently stepped into academic leadership roles in your universities. And so I know that you've been sort of involved in conversations where you're having to navigate these logics, these pressures that you may not necessarily align with. And so I'm wondering if you could talk to us about how you've seen disaster academic capitalism, white supremacy, colonialism, xenophobia really play out in the way that decisions are being made in your institutions.
Heather, would you like to start, or do you want me to jump in?
You can start, Kim. I'll let you go.
Sure. So, I believe I started chatting with the Dean of the College of Education about the possibility of becoming the Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and Faculty Affairs, maybe in February. So I wasn't quite sure what I was getting myself into when I agreed, and then on June 1st started in a role that was very different than what I originally anticipated it would be. And in many ways, while it felt overwhelming, saw it as a benefit that I actually had some understanding of these issues and was going into meetings and into these conversations where I could offer something that might be different from the ways that we were thinking about what we should do to address particularly faculty needs as we manage the pandemic. And I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this conversation because it pushed me to really crystallize something that's been rolling around in the back of my head for a while, and that what we're ultimately having conversations about and misunderstandings about is that the center of capitalism, it's what is productivity? And that we've framed this discourse around how unproductive we are. What are we going to do about the fact that people aren't producing the way that they used to? It doesn't look the same. And that in particular, how unproductive those who identify as women are, or to be more specific, how unproductive cis hetero women are. Who are mothers in particular, how unproductive faculty of color are, how unproductive women of color are, and what are we going to do about this, and how are they going to be recognized in the current structures and systems that we have? Like, how are we going to change the structures and systems? And I think in addition to what Gary mentioned earlier about, you know, really pushing people to have conversations about the fact that none of this is new, that these are simply exacerbated situations that have already been present, really starting to try to reframe and encourage people to rethink that actually people are not being unproductive. People are working very hard. Their productivity just looks different. And we need to do better in terms of developing structures and systems that recognize productivity and what productivity means in this time. And that the types of work that those who identify as women, women of color, men of color are engaging in are actually, in fact, in some ways more critical to the functioning of the institution and keeping us moving forward at this moment than maybe some of the other work that we're more comfortable with recognizing and have more traditionally recognized. So I've seen my role as being one where I can push and encourage people to think more about, okay, if we're saying that we want to do a better job of recognizing holistically what people are managing and recognizing holistically what teaching and research looks like in this context, how are we actually going to change structures and policies to do that? And how can it be beyond this moment? Because these are the unique contributions that these populations have been making to the Academy for a long period of time. I'm going to stop there. Heather, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. So unlike Kimberly, I came into my position right in full well knowing. I still wonder what I was thinking on a daily basis. And I get that chuckle from people all the time about accepting an administrative chair position in the midst of everything that being on fire. But I think that the other piece of that is that my hope is that I can offer some of the reflections that we've been talking about. Not that I have the answers, but I hope that it's a little bit of a different perspective. And what I've witnessed is that we really are asking our communities, our faculty, and particularly the faculty that are most deeply impacted by this pandemic, by ongoing state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown bodies, against trans bodies, that we are consistently asking them to continue to pull the most amount of work. And we're asking for unreasonable, really unreasonable things. And as Kimberly's talking about, like these kind of logics of production and how we're being productive or not being productive, even those conversations, I think, I've noticed that within some institutions, we see institutions actually coming up with grant opportunities, seed grants to investigate and research the impacts of COVID. And so I think we probably all had our own pools going on how long it would take our institutions or national organizations to come out with grants and RFPs for research on this topic, as if we weren't in the midst of it, and really ignoring what is required of this type of moment. And that is to, as Lee Patel talks about, embracing the pause, that this time really should be about reflecting and learning and deep thinking about our scholarship, our work, and how we're engaging. So even as we're having discussions about faculty evaluations and how are we going to manage this idea of production, and that people just aren't as productive as they normally are because things are held up at every level. I think that there's a deeper question that I continue to engage with around how we then maybe do away with this idea of production, because I'm not sure that that's what we need to be doing right now. And so in those conversations at different administrative levels, when we're seriously having talks about how do we engage in faculty evaluations right now, because people aren't able to have access to their research sites, or to really the only people that might have access are people that have access to a lab. But if you're engaging with communities, you don't have access, or times are slowed down for publications. And so the idea of moving away from a numeric evaluation system that was flawed in the first place, and moving to a more reflective kind of narrative approach are still really difficult conversations with people. And so it's been about how do we take this time then to really reflect on what is happening and take the pause and engage in acknowledging our humanity and honoring our humanity. So it's been certainly challenging to see the way that this plays out across the institution at all levels, that we're still demanding, and we really aren't taking the lessons that we need to take from this time.
Thank you both, Heather and Kim, for sharing that. Gerardo, we thought that, as we talked about in preparing for this, that maybe you could help us think about how disaster academic capitalism and white supremacy, white settler colonialism, how they come together at a more global, sort of international level. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe share your thoughts with us on that now.
Thank you. And I think I would like to return to what Gary was discussing in the beginning, how the crisis is becoming a justification to continue and accelerate things that were already happening. And here I just wanted to bring some examples from around the world. One very, very close to us, down in my home country of Mexico, where the government has already frozen a lot of the research available for funding, right? So some of the funding tied to the national system of researchers, which is similar to the National Science Foundation. There were awards already extended that our colleagues are not able to access. So that's just one example of how the discourse of austerity is already taking hold. So to exemplify, on the other hand, the discourse of hyper-competition, the central government in China has decided to allow higher enrollments, right? This means, in a planned economy, this means this would lower unemployment because people can stay in undergraduate and graduate programs longer. But it also, in another sense, it constitutes an investment in universities and the higher education system, when in our country, we are in many ways disinvesting from higher education. And in fact, we are exercising a policy of slash and burn. So I really think these are just examples of how ongoing discourses are just accelerating. But actually, I would like to turn around a little bit and looking at another international example that has been very encouraging to me, while not perfect. Some provinces in Australia have extended some of the protections to their general population around COVID, to protect from homelessness and food insecurity, to their international students, right, who are neither citizens nor permanent residents, and yet they are taking, during a very difficult crisis, this step to exercise solidarity rather than austerity. So I think I'm just kind of throwing here different examples of different responses, right? So we could have the austerity measures that actually will cause even longer effects, right? This is only going to slow down the recovery. We have examples of investment, sadly motivated by competition and this constant climbing in rankings, right? Because ultimately these investments that we are seeing actually obscure the real social impact of the crisis, but they also kind of capitalize on this opportunity to increase visibility in these league tables. And then finally, we have an example of solidarity that I think it's really up to us to highlight and emphasize which of these responses from our positions of expertise make sense to support, and from our positions of connectedness and solidarity, where do we want to really organize and promote? So I think sometimes there is a lot to learn from around the world. We are more connected than ever before, and I think we can certainly continue learning from examples beyond our borders.
Thanks so much, Gerardo, for that. Your comments, particularly your comment around the fact that austerity is actually going to prolong what we are, the horrible effects that we're all worried about, right? I was just reading a report this morning, and the report was out of a company, and I can provide a citation for this. I can't remember the company's name, but they're estimating, or they're reporting that 1 in 4 women are contemplating leaving the workplace. Now, it's a report done on corporate sector, but I think there's lots of insights in there that are relevant to us in academia. And the report goes on to say that for women of color, they are predicting that those rates of departure, or I won't call them departure, I'll say being pushed out, will be even higher. And so to your point, Gerardo, when we are unwilling to, engage different logics, right? Meaning push off the logics of productivity, like Heather mentioned, whether reforming those logics, reimagining what productivity could look like, reimagining what work could look like in higher ed, then we are positioning ourselves to lose the really hard won, I will just say, racial and gender diversity gains, although there's not enough, in the academy, right? I'm thinking about the academic workforce most specifically. Any racial gender diversity gains that we've made amongst, and I'm thinking about the tenure track faculty, have been hard won. And if those folks leave because of this situation, because of our unwillingness to engage in different ways of organizing and evaluating work, then we have bigger questions to engage with. And of course, if we start to think about, other categories of academic laborers, the question becomes even more urgent, I think. Gary, I'm going to hand off to you, and you're going to take us through some questions around resistance.
So thank you, Leslie. Great comments from everyone. I want to actually invoke something that Gerardo talked about the last time we were physically together at the last ASHE in a session with Leslie. And that's the notion of radical hospitality. So we're concentrating on workplaces. And I just want to say that in these times with this ongoing and accelerated academic capitalist practices, these logics of productivity, the white supremacy, the settler colonial logics, which are now on steroids, this happens in every crisis cycle. So I think back to about 10 years ago, the last recession. But what also happens is a counter-mobilization. And that counter-mobilization can take multiple forms. Since I study academic labor, I tend to focus on labor groups. So we see a number of graduate employees who have successfully negotiated contracts in major private universities back east, American University, Brown, Harvard, Georgetown. We see nationally in states like my own, wall-to-wall locals of United Campus Workers who combine staff and faculty and graduate and undergraduate employees. We see a level of mobilization that we haven't seen since the last recession. And we also see an increased questioning at the level of units. So it's not just unionization, it's the sort of thing that Heather and Kim were talking about. Even within your own unit, you have the capacity to collectively mobilize and change those practices about productivity. And so I think the challenge in counter-mobilization is to envision what are the other ways that we could be performing and enacting real performance, not just non-performative statements. And Gerardo's example of what's happening in Australia, I thought immediately when COVID hit of a local school district that is very under-resourced, but they use their school buses to deliver meals and to serve as Wi-Fi hotspots for their low-income, highly minoritized student population. The same thing is being done by some community colleges. A similar thing is being done in my state and other states by tribal colleges. So there are a variety of ways that we can counter-mobilize. Some of them are organizational, some of them are labor-based, some of them are simply within our own work units. And I think the challenge for all of us is how to, in the midst of this insanity, what could be more insane than talking about rankings when there's 220,000 people dead in the US and hundreds of thousands nationally? What could be more insane than giving a flip about rankings? What can we envision as alternative ways of organizing our time and resources that are truly about care? And I see that in the groups that I'm part of here at Arizona. I see that within my own unit, and I hear it in each of my colleagues' comments. So maybe we can walk through the ways that we try to envision collectively, because it can't just be up to us individually, collectively envision those possibilities of organizing our policies and practices and our lives in collectively supportive ways that embody what Gerardo talked about a year ago as radical hospitality. In a moment of crisis, you don't throw people out of lifeboats. You find ways to serve them. Whatever resources you have, you muster to support them. That's radical humanity. And I hear it from all of my colleagues, and I guess some good examples would be, it would be good for all of you to talk about some examples of how you do that in your workspaces. I don't know who would like to start on that. Gerardo, maybe the idea of radical hospitality. Can you explain what that is?
Certainly. Thank you, Gary. And I think this, of course, is going to look differently depending on our context, right? I tend to come to this idea from my own experience as an immigrant, but also with the work that I do with international students and with internationalization more broadly. We also, speaking of discourses that are accelerating, I think it would be remiss not to talk about how our government in the US is increasingly having hostile policies toward international students, toward international academics, right? With the limitations imposed in quite arbitrary ways on H visas and J visas as well, and just imposing, right, and all the obstructionism around not extending the flexibility for international students to take, for their own safety and the safety of others, courses online, right? So I think the idea, right, of compliance, and I think returning to what Gary was saying a moment ago, what could be crazier right now than thinking about rankings, but I would say thinking about all of these compliance requirements ultimately shouldn't be promoting learning, student learning in whatever format is safe for students and for instructors to deliver, regardless of what's one's passport or visa situation. So I think this is just a very clear example of the opposite, what we're trying to illustrate, right? So I think we are in a situation of increased hostility. And I think this discourse is very dangerous because it continues pitting us versus them and continues to frame higher education as this zero-sum game, as if others beyond our borders are taking away from us, right? And also, we have to speak up about the increasing xenophobia and racism. We certainly have some awareness, and this is heartening, about Black populations, domestic and international, but I also think we need to talk about the increasing racist xenophobia against Asian populations and Asian American citizens of our country. And I think this continues to play out, and it goes beyond words of choice. It really has to do with how people are being treated, how we're relating with each other, and who is considered an attractive or a dangerous population, right? So I think this is the time for solidarity and for speaking up with and for others, especially because there's a new credibility that comes by speaking to the experiences with other communities.
You know, I'll share with you, Gary, some of my thinking on your question. In the titling of this webinar, we were really intentional about using the language academic workforce. And there's a lot of thinking actually behind that. At one point in my career, you know, I've always looked at the academic labor faculty issues, right? There was one point in my career where I often used the language of the profession or the professoriate. And I'm changing that language, largely because I think that, and this is a solidarity move. I'm changing that language and using the language of academic labor or academic workforce to pull in as many folks as possible who are engaged in the teaching, the research, student-facing work that are often unaccounted for and most exploited in this system. So what does that mean? That means that now when I'm doing my research, when I'm doing any advocacy work, I currently hold a title called Faculty Advocate in my College of Education at the institution. I'm thinking simultaneously about how will this shape and affect the lives of tenure track folks, but even more importantly, those folks who are not on that tenure stream, who don't have the opportunity to have sort of a permanent position. How and will this policy, this decision see them, or will it not? And also included in the academic workforce are postdocs, grad students, and the number of categories of academic workers that are never seen in the academic labor force. And that's a trick, that's an intentional trick that our institutions use. They have all these categories of academic workers and nobody knows how to pull everyone together. And yet we're all engaged in similar types of work, have similar types of credentials. And when we think about those folks that are in those non-tenure track or contingent positions, we know that women of color are concentrated there. So now one of my acts of solidarity or coalition resistance is centering, first and foremost, folks that are not in the tenure stream and trying to understand how our agendas and interests might come together, but how their agendas and interests, folks that are not in a tenure stream position, might supersede or need to be centered in different ways. And I'll just sort of, I want to share with you all, as I've been trying to recenter, first of all, use the word academic workforce and recenter folks that are not on the tenure stream, I keep continuously going back to this book by Mickey Kendall on hood feminism. And she says, like, one of the most important moves in coalitional work is pretty much getting over your own feelings. Like, you may not always be at the center, and understanding how that needs to happen, sort of how you need to be willing to shift every so often. Anyways, that sort of came to my mind, Gary, when you raised the question.
Well, and I might maybe build off of what you're talking about, Leslie, a little bit, and just, you know, I wonder if the work of solidarity might even look like leaving the university behind and not doing the work of attempting to reform a rotten and corrupted project. And so for me, I think a lot about what does it mean to be with and alongside people through an education process that has always already foreclosed possibilities of education. I think a lot about especially trans women of color who have never been even able to enter the academy. And when trans women and trans girls and trans femmes do enter the academy, we're used as props for the betterment of an image rather than any kind of liberation for a population. So I've been pretty drawn recently to the work of Che Gossett and Juliana Huxtable. They talk about this idea of underworlding, which is what they talk about it as the creation of they call it a temporary fabulousness zone, where people can be with and alongside of each other and create worlds underneath the current rubble that exists. And I think part of where I'm seeing that through my work, and this is work that I feel really, really humbled to do this work alongside a current student that is just phenomenal, Cy Sims. In a couple of years, please hire Cy Sims. They're amazing. And also Alden Jones, who's a dear colleague of mine. But we're doing some work thinking about how trans life online and trans people living online are able to create different types of solidarities. And I go back to Gerardo, your comment about moving beyond borders. I'm also thinking about the digital corporeal or the digital material divide as well, in thinking about ways that we can think solidarities and imagine education in fundamentally different ways, and necessary ways, I think.
Great examples. Yeah, sometimes the organizing is easier virtually to create these imagined communities by not getting hung up on the local boundaries. So how about Heather or Kim about talking about how within your spaces, whether it's as, you know, in these administrative positions, although department head's not an administrative position, you're still one of us, Heather, how you operate nationally. Obviously, both of you operate on national scales, but also locally.
Yeah, so in listening to my colleagues here, I've really been thinking about some of the work that Leslie and I have been engaging with around coalition building, and everything that we're talking about in terms of, you know, honoring care, and even Gerardo's talking about like radical hospitality. I tend to frame in terms of of relationships, right? From an Indigenous perspective, then how are we entering these spaces as being in relationship with one another? And so even there's a question in our Q&A about how we continue this kind of counter mobilization work, both within and outside of the academy, beyond the crisis of the current pandemic, right? There's always going to be, there always has been, and there always will be a crisis, especially as we think about our various populations and communities. And so for me, it's really been about how do we enter these spaces from a relational perspective and from an ethic of love and care for and with one another. And that means that in those relationships, we are responsible to, we are answerable to one another and to our communities. And so everything that Leslie's talking about and thinking about those who are less protected and thinking about reframing the academic workforce, it's about who are we answerable to and who are we responsible to? And that extends beyond the current crisis, because this is not a new crisis for many of us, right? And so I think about, for me, it's that one, refusal of borders, refusal of categories, refusal of the scarcity logics that pit us against one another. And so in listening to Z talk about what does that look like outside of, like when we rid ourselves of the university, I think about Audra Simpson's work and Sandy Grande, and what does it mean then to refuse the university and these spaces? And I think that at the center of that is our relationships. And if that is at the center of how we are entering these spaces, then that work continues and is so much more powerful.
Yeah, that's great. And I think of people who define their work in terms of the communities that are being served, defining what is success, whether that's a native nation and it's nation building, or whether it's a local community. How about you, Kim?
I've been thinking about care a lot. I really appreciate your comments so much, Heather. And as you were talking earlier, I was thinking about how many of us are struggling with mental health and well-being during this time, how many academics struggle with mental health and well-being outside of these times, but particularly during this time, how that's being exacerbated, and how in some ways as institutions, we're not completely comfortable, but somewhat more comfortable with developing policy that address the needs of parents, like because we can, see that and wrap our brains around that in one way, but much less comfortable with expanding that to acknowledge that folks need a different level of care now and probably always have. And we need more space for people to talk about that. And so I think when I think of myself as an administrator that centers care, who thinks about developing relationship and being in connection with people, how can we go beyond relying on the fact that as an individual, I care? How can we write care into policy? How can we ensure that we are reminding people, these are the multiple ways that you can demonstrate your care, that we can develop policy, but we can also develop guidelines and guidance. And I've been really pleased and proud to be involved in some efforts at the University of Maryland where we've done that. And we've talked a bit about like, okay, so yes, we can talk about these populations that are being impacted by COVID, but how can we make this policy or these guidelines more broad to really encourage people to get to know your faculty on an individual level, to get to know what they might be struggling with, and to be more creative in how we address those disparities, to think outside of the box of what we usually do, and really center individuals and their needs. So as an administrator, I think about it in that way. And then I think it's just part of my individual practice and my practice in multiple communities of scholars, just connecting back to the ideas of productivity and that I'm not what I produce, that in many ways, we all need to say no more. We all need to shut our laptops more. We all need to rest more. And it's really hard to do that as an individual. It's hard to preach that to other people, but perhaps easier to preach that to other people than to do it for ourselves. So I'm trying to do a better job of being mindful of that, of modeling that when I can, of encouraging my friends and colleagues to do that, to allow them to encourage me to do that. That those are how I'm kind of thinking about those ideas, and having my own life be maybe a form of resistance.
So I think we're just about at the end, right, Leslie?
Yeah, we are.
I just want to say one thing about one of the questions that came up. I tried to answer a couple of questions in the chat or in the question and answer. One of them was about how to sustain energy. And it's kind of to your point, Kimberly, about, these are really difficult times. It can be challenging in academia, even apart from these times. So how to sustain your mental health and your sense of joy amidst counter-mobilization that is confronted by this ongoing but heightened system that seems almost insurmountable. And I just think it's so important in these collectivities to center what I get from all of you, which is I get energized by being with you. It's a positive energy, a sense of fulfillment, a sense of joy, a sense of hope, a sense of efficacy. And I think in our counter-mobilization, it's so important through our relationships, as both you and Heather mentioned, Kimberly, and you as well, Z, to cultivate those positive feelings of the fight and the battle are in themselves worth it, even though the odds are high. And so I think that's one of the draining things oftentimes about counter-mobilization. So if you can find ways to do how I feel about this group and how I feel about my group in Arizona, and I know you all feel about the groups that you're part of, if we can bring that to our collective counter-mobilization, I think it's a little easier to sustain. Leslie?
So thank you all for being here today and for just being in community first and foremost, taking some time out of your schedule and just sharing. And I want to thank everybody who was able to tune in as well. I'm going to display a few quotes that our phenomenal panelists sent in. These quotes were intended to leave the audience and hopefully one another with a sense of joy and a sense of also, ideas about how to resist, big and small ways. Resistance comes in big and small ways. And I'll wrap up by just encouraging folks and letting you know that we'll provide the resources that folks cited today. One last resource that I want to just name is there's a wonderful conversation between Elizabeth Martinez and Angela Davis that you can find online. And they talk about the different kinds of coalitions, collectives, and networks. And one of the great pieces of advice in that conversation is that sometimes coalitions build around one issue and then it's time to disband because they've gotten to success, they won. Not to forget the small successes, not to forget the small wins, and to know that it's okay to move on to other things. We'll provide that resource along with the other citations that we mentioned today, and we thank all of you for joining us. Take good care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.